What's going on, freaks and friends? Let's begin the sixth entry of the John Carpenter review series. We're taking a look at The Fog from 1980. The Fog stars Adrienne Barbeau, Jamie Lee Curtis, Tom Atkins, Hal Holbrook. We also have smaller appearances from Janet Leigh, Nancy Loomis, and Charles Cyphers. And this was the sixth overall film done by John Carpenter as far as the official feature lengths go, but it's really the fourth film as far as theatrical release is concerned, whereas the last two, Someone's Watching Me and Elvis, were shot for TV films. Not to say that those two are bad or anything, but of course they are a little, you could say, less significant, I think, maybe among the fan base as far as Carpenter's films are concerned. But this one I know is definitely a fan favorite, and for very good reason. So in The Fog, the seaside town of Antonio Bay is celebrating its 100th anniversary. However, the circumstances behind the town's founding are sort of shrouded in mystery, and that mystery sort of begins to unfold as the film progresses. We go to find out that the town's founders essentially ambushed and caused another ship to crash. For fear of starting a leper colony, they decided, hey, we're going to crash this ship and cause them to die, steal their gold. Nobody's going to care in 100 years. That is soon proven to be wrong, as what turns out to be in The Fog is the vengeful ghosts of the ship that crashed prior to the town's founding. And what really unfolds here is a really interesting sort of ghost story that kind of thrives on that small town with a secret flair to it. One of the interesting elements to the story is Adrienne Barbeau's character, where basically she plays this radio DJ who operates in this lighthouse sort of on the outside of Antonio Bay, and she's the one who sees the fog rolling in with some help from the weatherman, Charles Cyphers. And throughout most of the movie, she is more or less sort of trapped in the lighthouse to try and keep the town updated on, hey guys, this is what's going on. I get the feeling that there's something not right about the fog. Those suspicions are proven to be correct, as we see throughout the town. The weatherman himself, played by Charles Cyphers, meets a brutal demise while he's on the phone with her. There was also a boat at the beginning of the film which had George Buckflower on it. You know, the fog rolls in when they're like, Buckflower says something about, I don't see no fog bank out there, and then just keeps looking out the window and there's a fog bank out there. So they go up deck and, you know, they meet a gruesome end. That sort of figures into the story just a little bit later, where we have Tom Atkins and Jamie Lee Curtis visiting at the morgue, where one of the bodies comes back to life a little bit, and the whole circumstance there too is kind of sketchy, because the bodies are said to have drowned when there was no water inside the boat at all. So it's like there's no way they could have drowned, and the mercury in the thermometer was like stuck at 20 degrees, which is like, okay, it's a hot ass summer day, why is this thermometer reading 20 degrees? So, you know, there's already this little air of mysterious something's not right going on. And that sort of plays throughout the whole first act of the film. Even there's a sequence where Adrienne Barbeau's kid, he's out playing on the shoreline, just gets back from trying to go fishing and whatnot. And he sees this little gold coin on the rocks, and that just turns into this piece of wood. And it's from the Elizabeth Dane, the ship that was crashed there 100 years ago. And that's interesting too, because there's a point where Jamie Lee Curtis is being told by Tom Atkins about that. He's talking about, my father had found this coin one time when he came back from a boating trip, and he had it in his front pocket. He was going to show it to me, but there was nothing there. He should have mentioned something about a wet spot too, because that kind of happens to the little piece of, they called it driftwood is what Adrienne Barbeau was calling it, because she takes it down to her radio station where it just sort of turns into water when it's got these really this really eerie sort of sound is coming from her whole little recording setup, and I think it's like the ghost of the Blake character sort of channeling through there, and just turns to water. That was some freaky, really abnormal shit to be happening there. But there's just all kinds of wild, unexplainable stuff going on in the first act, especially there's this whole sequence. It's like right after the old guy at the beginning he's telling the kids a little story about Antonio Bay, little campfire story. We just see all this crazy stuff going on, powers going off in some places, glasses breaking, car alarms are going off, and it's even explained by the characters throughout the film too that it was kind of strange. Dogs barking out at the water, just all kinds of wild stuff. And that, of course, all sort of comes to a head later in the film when, again, the fog rolls into town, and it's weird because the wind is going eastward or blowing westward because, if they're Antonio Bay, California, so I believe the wind was going west, but the fog is still coming in from the east, which is like an absolute weather anomaly, If anybody could figure out that, that shouldn't be happening that way. But, the fog's taking over the town, and essentially what it is it's the ghosts from the Elizabeth Dane that would have formed a leper colony. They were the ones in the fog that are basically coming back to take revenge 100 years later. And essentially being that the town is still inhabited by the descendants of the founders, it only makes sense that they sort of do this little blood vengeance kind of thing, it's the sins of the father kind of deal. It's that sort of concept going on there, which I think is really cool, because it just adds sort of a layer to, I don't want to say the motivation, but that's basically what it is. It adds a layer to the motivation of the ghosts of the undead sailors. And, it really comes to a head in the climax where Adrienne Barbeau is being cornered by a few of these sort of ghostly ghouls with swords and knives and shit. They end up chasing her to the top of the lighthouse, and you think they've got her. Meanwhile, Tom Atkins with Jamie Lee Curtis and, essentially the rest of the central cast, they're up at the church with Hal Holbrook, and he had found his grandfather's diary, who was one of the founders, therefore one of the conspirators, because in the diary it explains the whole thing. He's cornered specifically by the ghost of Blake. And apparently all the gold that was on the ship was melted into a cross that was in the walls of the church. And he's like, hey, this is what you guys want. I'm essentially the sixth conspirator because of the whole bloodline sins of the father deal. That whole sequence is pretty insane because it almost harkens back to the sort of siege-like element of Assault on Precinct 13 where, they're barring themselves in. But from the outside, you just see them coming in, smashing through the windows, and trying to bust down the door. It's a pretty intense whole final act there. And it's weird, too, because I must have remembered this movie wrong because I, for some reason, remember it being that he dies, Hal Holbrook's character, Father Malone, I, for some reason, remember him dying there when Blake is holding the cross and the cross is illuminating and everything. But it doesn't die until the final scare of the film. And I don't know how I was able to misremember that. Because when I was watching it this last time in preparation for this video, finally, I was like, wait, isn't he supposed to die here? And then, the movie sort of ends on a relatively positive note before we get that final scare. It's like, that's where he goes. The acting overall in this film is pretty good, too, for being still fairly early on in John Carpenter's career. I mean, the man, he has a good set of actors who come through his films. Of course, you've got the regulars. Adrienne Barbeau and Jamie Lee Curtis, they're freaking great actresses. Tom Atkins is always putting on a bang performance, and this is his first appearance in the John Carpenter pantheon. We have Nancy Loomis in here. Her acting is a lot better in this film, I feel, than it was in Halloween and Assault on Precinct 13. Charles Cyphers, this is, I believe, his 5th run with John Carpenter, and he's just so charming whenever he's in these films here. George Buckflower in his first John Carpenter performance. And for the second time, we see Darwin Jostin, who, if you remember, was Napoleon in Assault on Precinct 13. I actually didn't realize that until I was going through the cast. I was like, wait, I think I recognize that name. That's got to be important. So jumped on Letterboxd, and there it was. It's like, you've seen 2 movies with him. I'm like, oh, bang on. So, those regulars are up in here. Of course, the acting all around, too, from Hal Holbrook's character is absolutely amazing. I really like the chemistry, too, with going back to Nancy Loomis, her and Janet Leigh's little chemistry. That's a lot of fun, where Nancy Loomis is the snarky assistant to the very professional Janet Leigh, and I don't think she really gets a lot to do with her daughter, Jamie Lee Curtis, in this, but it was nice to see those 2 ladies together, Jamie Lee and Janet Leigh, to see them together in a film. That was, hey, this is pretty cool. It's not quite like their little meta relationship in Halloween H20, but it's just nice to see them this early on in Jamie Lee's career on the same screen. And Jamie Lee with Tom Atkins, that whole relationship is pretty interesting, because, she's just a hitchhiker trying to come through town, gets picked up by Tom Atkins, he's being his freaking badass self, minus the mustache, which is, quite frankly, probably the scariest thing in this film, is a clean-shaven Tom Atkins. That's just how I feel on that. But he picks up Jamie Lee Curtis, he's driving his truck, drinking a beer. It's like, just wow. Just absolutely outrageous there. And he ends up landing her in bed. And after they're done, hey, what's your name, by the way? It's like, oh my god, you guys are, like, officially the coolest couple in a horror film I've ever seen. That's just the power of Tom Atkins right there, I guess. But yeah, no, the performances in this, they're all, either the actor is really great or the characters are just fun, and that is usually propelled by pretty good acting. So the performances overall get a pretty good, solid rating on this one. And there's a little bit of a name game going on, too, with some of the actors playing different characters. Tom Atkins' character is called Nick Castle. We all know Nick Castle is the O.G. Myers, co-writer for the next film we'll be covering, Escape from New York, and he went on to have a pretty solid directorial career in his own right. Charles Cyphers plays a guy called Dan O'Bannon. That's his character's full name. If we look back to Dark Star, that was the primary actor and co-writer there. I believe he also wrote Alien and Return of the Living Dead, which he also directed. Let's see, John Carpenter himself has a little appearance here, and Jesus Christ, John Carpenter, the man is a great director and great composer, but acting is definitely not his forte at this point in his career, because his line delivery is absolutely, oh man, just no. But anyway, John Carpenter plays a character called Bennett, and if you look at the whole wider credits, his character's called Bennett Tramer. We all know who Ben Tramer is, guys. Come on. One of the guys on the boat with George Buckflower, and Buckflower himself plays a character called Tommy Wallace, Tommy Lee Wallace. But there's a guy on the boat with him, played by James Canning. His character is called Dick Baxter, who I saw on the commentary was actually an old friend of John Carpenter, but, you know, most John Carpenter fans on the surface, when we hear that name, it's like, we remember the car ride in Halloween when Nancy Loomis says, well, ask Dick Baxter, he'll go out with you. So, you know, just that whole little thing with the character names, it's just too much fun. Extremely nerd level, but it's like, yeah, the John Carpenter cinematic universe, it's sort of a real thing there. And there's even Russellville Road, too, which is pretty cool. It's where the weather station is, if I remember correctly. Of course, the cinematography by Dean Cundey is great in this film, and it always is, because Dean, whether he's doing a Carpenter film or otherwise, the dude is just a professional. And if I remember correctly, he shot the Back to the Future films, which look really great. So, you know, if you could shoot Halloween and Back to the Future in your career, Jurassic Park, you know, you've pretty much cemented yourself as one of the great cinematographers of all time. So Dean Cundey, I'll probably do a whole separate video maybe where I would talk about his work. But from a technical standpoint, this film just looks great on account of Dean Cundey. Like, that, probably one of the craziest shots in the film is, it's just a simple shot, but it's when Adrienne Barbeau is going down the stairs at the lighthouse. Like, you see, like, she's coming down the stairs, and she passes the camera, and we see her going down the stairs, and it's just a clean cut to the bottom. Like, just, that just looks so fucking, so perfect. But you've still got some of the previous offenders as far as collaborators go behind the scenes, too. Of course, Deborah Hill, co-producer on here. Tommy Lee Wallace was still involved. Yeah, so to see them back in the John Carpenter fold is pretty great. I believe the last time we saw all them together was when we did Halloween, back on Halloween, for the Halloween Revisited review there. One thing that really plays to the benefit of the fog is, well, the central fog itself. I believe, if I remember correctly, it was achieved with dry ice, because you can't just summon fog on command. It just doesn't work like that. So I think they use dry ice and fans or something to create that effect. But when you add that already to the sort of atmosphere that just naturally appears in these earlier John Carpenter films that were shot by Cundey, it just brings the film up to a whole new level. Like, the atmosphere is one thing this film has in spades. So atmosphere is definitely a 10 out of 10. The music by John Carpenter, I think this is probably one of his better scores. Might not be as iconic as something like Halloween. That is just up there with like Star Wars, where it's, you hear it and you know what it's from. But The Fog, I think, musically almost, I would say, is better than Halloween. Like, I would probably rather listen to this than the score for Halloween, honestly, just because it's got a little more sort of sonic variety going on with it. A really great score by John Carpenter here. I think as far as like the little extra bits that make Carpenter films what they are, those were like the last two that I really wanted to touch on majorly here. One thing I do want to bring up also is my experience with this film. The first time I saw this version of The Fog, the John Carpenter film, was, I believe, 2018 or 2019. It was only a few years ago that I got around to seeing this one. And, you know, I had seen The Fog from 2005, not completely, but I'd seen portions of it on TV. And the only thing I remember was the babysitter's death. I don't remember if her name was Mrs. Coberts in that one. But it's like one of the fucking fog hand comes out of the drain on the sink and just grabs her wrist, and she ends up freaking, I don't know, that's all I remember. That was relatively creepy, but that's the only thing I really remember from that one. And, you know, it's like, oh, The Fog, whatever. And, you know, I'm like, oh, it's also a film from the early 80s by the guy who did Halloween with Jamie Lee Curtis. Huh. Well, let's check it out. And originally I was just kind of meh on The Fog, but, you know, repeated viewings, I came to appreciate it a lot more and more, and it's one of those ones I like it more every time I watch it. And, like, also with my sensibilities and taste sort of maturing, I think that The Fog is one that just kind of grew on me in a lot of ways. I would imagine, like, if I had seen this one earlier in life, I would have already been at this point for a long time. And it's one that I really do wish that I was able to see as a kid, because it's just too freaking cool. And a couple other things I want to say too is the opening campfire scene. The way it opens with the whole campfire tale, it almost begs the question, what if the events of this movie didn't really happen? Like, whether it's... Because this is just one of those new things that a lot of people like, is it was all a dream or whatever, you know? But to sort of humor that idea, what if the events of The Fog didn't happen? Right? What if it was just part of the old man's story? Or what if it was just, damn it, I forget his name, the son... Tommy, no... What the fuck is his name? Let's see. Flip to the book here. Andy. What if it was like a nightmare that Andy had after hearing the campfire story? Now, cool, that would have been interesting for 1980, I'm sure. But, you know, today I feel like that kind of thing is... It's just sort of a cop-out in storytelling, so I do much prefer the film as it is, like just an unexplained supernatural event that happens, and because the right is attempted to, or the wrong is attempted to be made right. I like that is really the angle that the story takes, where it's like, okay, so unexplained event comes in, happens, and then goes away or does it. Like, there's just something about that I think is a little scarier. But I still felt that it was interesting to bring up the idea, what if the events of The Fog were really just even in the imagination of our characters that we're dealing with. Just sort of a little idea. And I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of that idea, but again, I still felt that it was interesting enough to point out. Like, what if? Another little what if situation that I want to throw out here is, what if this film was called Halloween, The Fog, where this could have began the whole serialization or anthology angle of the Halloween series that they tried to do with Halloween 3. What if this was where that started? And if that being, if they had done this, they wouldn't have been able to do Halloween 2 as they had done. So that's just a little throwing that out there. Like, you could have reworked it just a little bit, but it would have been an interesting step in that direction. I think it's kind of fun to watch this one with that sort of idea in mind. It's like you could even throw Prince of Darkness in there as sort of a candidate for the Halloween anthology idea. So overall, The Fog is definitely a thrilling, atmospheric engagement of a film. It's definitely a good way to spend your time watching this one. If you like ghost stories, if you like that sort of secretive small town idea, this is definitely a film to sort of dip your toes into, as it does have both of those going on. Again, the music is on point here, and with the acting, it just elevates this film to a super freaking level. It's definitely a masterpiece of early 80s horror in general, and it's definitely a cornerstone staple of John Carpenter's filmography. And I feel as though I have no choice, and I tried not to want to do this, but this one is definitely, I'd say, out of John Carpenter's films, a perfect film. So The Fog easily gets 5 thirsty weathermen out of 5. What did you guys think of The Fog? Do you think this is one of John Carpenter's better films? Do you not like The Fog so much? Tell me what you guys think. Would it have been a great entry in that sort of anthology angle for Halloween? Let me know your answers to that and more down below. Shoot a thumbs up if you like this video and subscribe if you want. I'll see you in the next one. Thank you guys.